Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to the 9th installment in our lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty, by Dr. Eric Foner. This one is entitled The Market Revolution, 1800 to 1840. The first section is called A New Economy. The focus question for this section is, what were the main elements of the market revolution? The phenomenon known as the market revolution radically transformed first the economic life of Americans in the early 19th century and then the social and political lives of Americans as well. The catalyst behind this market revolution was a series of innovations in transportation and communication: steamboats, canals, railroads, the telegraph, an expanded road system. The development of steam-powered engines undergirded this transformation in transportation and communication. James Watt in 1776 perfected an improved steam engine. And then Robert Fulton by 1808 perfected the steam-powered boat engine. And it was really that steamboat that really radically transformed and initiated this market revolution. Steamboats could not only decrease the amount of time it took to travel across the oceans, it also for the first time allowed for efficient travel up rivers against the currents of the rivers, which greatly expanded the scope of transportation and dramatically increased the speed of getting goods to market. It also drastically lowered the expense of commerce, particularly around those transportation costs. And for the first time, it linked farmers, particularly in rural areas far from the urban centers where markets had traditionally been held. It linked them to national and world markets. In 1800, most farm families were self-sufficient and not connected to national or world markets. But this market revolution would radically transform that and shift farming, particularly in the North, more towards commercialization and less towards self-sufficient homesteading. The success of the steamboat led to new calls to develop a canal system in the United States. Canals were a way to connect existing waterways to each other, which greatly expanded the scope and the reach of the market revolution in this era. The first of these canals was the Erie Canal, finally finished in 1825. This canal connected the Hudson River with the Great Lakes and allowed goods to flow freely between the Great Lakes region and New York City, which opened up the Ohio Valley region in particular and connected them more closely with those eastern markets. And it also led to the increase in the importance of New York City as a market hub and a national and international port. Now, at the beginning, the development of transportation infrastructures like canals were mostly financed by individual states. The federal government had little involvement at this stage. The Erie Canal proved to be such an astounding success that it led to a scramble of other states trying to develop their own canal systems to match the success that New York had with the Erie Canal. The next significant development in transportation and commerce in this era was the development of the railroads. Railroads opened up new areas for settlement and commerce, particularly those areas that were not near any navigable waterways. Railroads also greatly stimulated the coal and iron industries, which became very important to the growing economy in the United States in the 19th century. The first railroad established was the Baltimore and Ohio, which was finished in 1828. Another significant development in this period was the telegraph, invented by Mr. Samuel Morse in 1835. The telegraph made instantaneous communication possible for the first time in human history and allowed people in far-flung areas of the country to be able to connect with each other at a speed heretofore unthinkable to most people. Now, initially this service was for business. It greatly increased the speed and the rate of business and allowed people in distant territories to conduct business in market centers on a daily basis. It also increased the scope of journalism at this time, as well as newspapers use the telegraph to spread news across the country at an exponentially faster rate, which also helped to connect people ever more closely into the growing social and political debates going on during the times. The maps that you see here on this slide illustrate the dramatic and exponential increase in the speed of travel in the early 19th century. Between 1800 and 1830, the time it took for goods and people and information to travel from the rural backcountry regions to a market hub like New York was cut literally in half due to the developments in canals and railroads and other transportation systems like that. And it cannot be emphasized how important this reduction in the speed of travel was to the advancement of commerce and business in this era, and as well as the spread of settlement into the West as Western settlers became more and more connected with the hubs of commerce and business in the East, which allowed them to plug into these expanding commercial networks and gain their own little piece of that pie. As was alluded to in the previous slide, the connection of the Western territories beyond the Appalachian Mountain regions to the eastern hub of markets and commerce via things like the canals and railroads and expanded roadways, coupled with the decrease in the Indian population in those western territories after the War of 1812, led to a new flood of western migration into those regions. People generally moved in groups and established whole new communities in the regions that they moved into. One stream of this migration brought slavery to the newly created Cotton Kingdom, which we will elaborate further on in just a little bit. Migration generally took a direct east to west pattern, so that southern migration generally reflected a migration straight west into the newly expanding territories such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc. Northern migration generally took place from, the old New England territories and Pennsylvania straight west into northern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. There was very little north-south migration or anything like that. So, therefore, the cultures and the mindsets of the particular eastern regions were reflected directly westward in those migrants that expanded into those regions. And regional cultures in the West looked very much like the cultures those migrants left behind in the East. Very significant development in the early 19th century was the development and the expansion of what historians have termed the cotton kingdom. Now, this was facilitated by the invention of the cotton gin. Now, Eli Whitney did not invent the cotton gin per se, but he perfected a version of the cotton gin in 1794 that quickly caught on amongst cotton producers. And the cotton gin allowed for production of cotton on an extremely large scale. Now, the function of the cotton gin was basically to remove the seeds from the boll of the cotton plant, a process that by hand was extremely painstaking and time-consuming. The cotton gin made this process much more rapid and efficient, which greatly expanded the potential of cotton manufacturing in the United States. The northern economy greatly facilitated this expansion as well. As the northern economy was industrializing, textile manufacturing became one of the linchpins of this industrialization of the North and became an extremely lucrative trade for northern manufacturers, which in turn created an intense demand for cotton that southern plantation owners were more than willing to provide for them. The invention of the cotton gin and this new industrial demand for cotton also created a new demand for slaves in the South. Whereas the founding fathers and the thinkers of the late 18th century envisioned that slavery was on its deathbed at the turn of the 19th century, the invention of the cotton gin and the expansion of cotton production in the South reversed that trend and made slavery even more deeply entrenched into the Southern economy and society and made it even more difficult to disentangle the United States as a whole from the institution of slavery. Between 1800 and 1860, around 1 million slaves were shifted from the older slave states like Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina to the Deep South. The Deep South area, particularly Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the soil there was perfect for cotton production. And as slavery was becoming less important in those older southern states like Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, the expansion of cotton into the Deep South made slavery even more important in that region. And slaveholders in those old slave states were more than willing to unload their excess slaves into the Deep South where they were needed to lessen their burden and to increase their own profits from the sale of those enslaved peoples. The majority were transported by slave traders across land routes across the Deep South to be sold at auction in places like New Orleans and Charleston and Savannah. Slave trading became a well-organized and profitable business that destroyed African American families and broke up long-standing African American communities. Cotton in general became a linchpin of Southern development and the most important American export of the 19th century. And the importance of cotton production in the South led to a de-emphasis in the South on the increase in industrialization and other commercial developments like that, which led to an even sharper distinction between not only the economies, but the social distinctions between the North and the South as well. Alright gang, that concludes part 1 of our Chapter 9 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.